Hey, hello, whatever time of day this video may find you. I am currently sitting on a slightly damp and chilly Sunday morning, and it is perfect reading weather, so I am so happy. If you joined me for our last Feature Friday, What Stalks Among Us, I kind of was feeling a little nostalgic, which actually kind of segues perfectly into today because I'd already planned to reread my least favorite high school assigned reading today. And nostalgia kind of factors into this in a couple of different ways. The first and most obvious being I'm no longer in high school, so we're revisiting something that I read a long time ago. And you might be like, Melody, why are you rereading something you know you didn't enjoy? And here's the thing, I am a much different person now than I was when I read this at like 15? I have lived a whole nother lifetime since I first read this book, which kind of hurts to think about, but is the truth. So if I have responded in the last couple of years to the Bridgerton books completely differently in my 30s than I did in my teenage years, there is also the chance that I will respond completely differently to this book than I did in my teenage years. Now, I did post an Instagram story to try and see if anybody would have any guesses on what my least favorite high school assigned reading was. Now, granted, I don't have a huge Instagram following on my Bookstagram, so I wasn't expecting tons of engagement, but I did get a couple of guesses. The first was The Great Gatsby, which I believe I've mentioned it here briefly before. I am shocked. I was never assigned to The Great Gatsby in school. I read it on my own in high school, but I didn't have any of those like symbolism conversations outside of what I stumbled upon on my own. So that is not the book. And the next guess was Lolita, which I am not as shocked to say wasn't ever assigned to me in school, but I do have a really bad first date story that this book factors into. It was an only date story, but needless to say, if you find yourself having to try and explain to your date why Humbert is not a sympathetic character, regardless of how we got on that topic, I surely don't remember. Maybe not second date material. But anyway, those were two really good guesses. Neither of them were the book. If you want to get in a guess below before I do the reveal, feel free to lock your answers in now. I was a little shocked no one said Wuthering Heights because I had made my distaste of Wuthering Heights known. That was not guessed. And I have been meaning to revisit Wuthering Heights, but I'm not really ready to make that commitment. So one last chance to get guesses in if you want with some additional hints. First, I read this freshman year. Two, it is from a well-assigned required reading author, but it is not a book I would consider the most assigned from this author. So this is the last chance because the book was in fact, or is in fact, Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. I actually have not encountered anyone else who was ever assigned this book in school, and this has stayed with me through the years as a book I actually detested. It was for a long time one of my only one-star reviews on Goodreads, and I think I have mentioned this book on this channel before because it was taught to us in relation of circular plot structure, or kind of introducing the idea that not everything is going to be your typical Aristotelian climactic plot structure. Now, I've talked recently about how I felt like this wasn't the best choice for that, or that it didn't subvert anything strongly enough for me because there's so many options, and especially if we're looking at things like diversifying our reading. And as an adult, as I've experienced work out in the world, the most successful works for me as a reader that haven't really fit in to the Aristotelian mold have often been written by writers of color. Additionally, having been through a theater feminism class in college, we looked a little bit at structure, and I have read Helene Cizot's Laugh of the Medusa. Again, I know I'm butchering the French and I apologize. I last talked about this essay in relation to Matrix by Lauren Groff because it is kind of exploring how we can utilize language and the kind of circular structures that were being presented as a more feminine mode of storytelling, especially when we're looking at things like the heroine's journey versus the hero's journey, which I am by no means an expert in. And so this book was taught to us or presented to us as an example of circular structure. And instead, as a teenager, it felt so frustrating. I remember being almost angry because nothing was happening. And if we kind of revisit this idea of nostalgia, I definitely think that plays into my teenage reception of this book as well, because this is set in 1928 in Waukegan, Illinois, basically. It's not called Waukegan, but it's basically Waukegan. And it is set over the course of this summer, which is the kind of circular nature of the storytelling. However, it's very much looking at childhood and this simpler time with this kind of rosy recollection. And in many ways, it felt like that kind of mythologizing of small town Americana that we would have gotten in like the 50s, but the pre-Depression version of that. And having grown up in a very small town, this book didn't feel nostalgic to me. It didn't feel like I was looking back at something fondly. Rather, it felt stagnant. It felt like I was going to be trapped in this kind of small town mentality forever. Now I can look back at it and see it in the same vein as things like Music Man and State Fair, both musicals, Picnic, the play Picnic, and many other works. But at the time, it felt like I was looking into a future where the same things happened over and over and over, and I was never going to escape that circle, and it really bummed me out. Additionally, having read the author's note that came in this edition, Bradbury talks about how he kind of stumbled across this novel, and it was almost like word association writing exercises that he was doing, so there wasn't really a structure here, I would argue, even in the circular sense, and I'm not an expert on non-traditional story structures, to be clear, but in a sense we're getting a slice of life here, right? But from different little parts of this town that are kind of presented as a through line via these two little boys that are experiencing their summer, and we're looking at it through the lens of like rites and ceremonies, things that happen over and over every summer, things we look forward to, those rites of passage of summer, and then like new experiences and kind of findings. And having read that author's note, how this came about makes a lot more sense, but there was a lot of frustration for me as a teenage reader in not having anything to really grasp onto. Even now, I was kind of interested in what my reception would be because I was thinking maybe it was more of a cluster of short stories, and I just wasn't ready for that at the time. But I'm about halfway through now. We're gonna finish today, and I don't know if it really has a short story structure. Kind of. There are different stories that I would argue are more short story-esque than others. So it is kind of this collage of this vision of this small town. And that nostalgia is definitely there. I would argue for better and for worse, because there are parts of this that do not age well. For instance, the way that Native and Indigenous populations are portrayed in what was accepted, unfortunately, at this time as kind of normal boy play isn't great, doesn't age well. Additionally, I just read a story where all the little boys go over to this older man's house and they view him as like a time machine because he's been around so long, he can tell them these stories and transport them to these different places. And they ask him, were you alive during the Civil War? And he was like, yes. And he's kind of full of it because he's telling them that he's at all of these battles that they mentioned. They ask him what side he fought on, and he's like, oh, I can't remember. And there's like this bleeding. And so there's also this sense that, oh, it doesn't really matter. And there's no kind of like interrogating that in a way that small town life sometimes just accepts things and doesn't always really interrogate it. And so even now, I do want to be able to look at this with a little bit more nostalgia, but bits like that I can't really get nostalgic about. And I definitely still recognize the portions in this narrative where I, as a reader, especially a teenage reader, would have felt trapped in some ways. And even as the narrative really is exploring this idea of change that is coming to this town, we see the last trolley ride and buses taking over as public transport. So there is this sense of change. My perception at the time of small town life was a kind of lack of change. I could recognize the rites and the rituals, the things I looked forward to every year, the events and gatherings that were my kind of markers for telling time throughout the year, and my like hope of seeing people, as I discussed in my last video talking about getting excited for the fair every year. So I'm going to be very interested to see how I continue to respond to this. One of the things I remember most about our Socratic seminar discussions in class, I haven't really gotten to yet outside of a couple of throwaway references, which honestly kind of might encompass the whole thing, because there is a lot in this book that is happening on the periphery, but not like in a bone clocks kind of way that feels like it's more interesting than what's going on in the main action. For instance, and example, in relation to this discussion, there is potentially a serial killer in this small town this summer, and it's not really explored at all. And this idea that these women have been killed, there is reference to it in the text, but it's just kind of treated as a blip in this summer. And on one hand, I can maybe understand it. One, again, I haven't really gotten to the meat of where that is explored in the narrative yet, but if we're viewing this through the eyes of two young boys, that may not register the same to them as it would to adults. However, at the same time, certain portions, certain stories of this are being introduced through the eyes of an adult, and we are seeing things through their eyes. And so I just don't know how I'm going to respond to that this second go around, because it does feel there is still this kind of anxiousness that is building in me, a little bit of frustration, because it feels like we should be going somewhere. And I know this kind of like slice of life is the point of this. And if we are talking about it from a structural point of view, sure, maybe I am responding to something that I think should be happening because of that Aristotelian structure, but I feel like I respond to this book differently than I do to other kind of non-traditional structures in books. For instance, Bestiary or Bestiary by Ming Chang, I thought was super compelling and innovative, and it did not have a typical Aristotelian structure. And I don't remember it leaving me feeling as frustrated as this book does. And I don't know if it's because it's like showing this past without really complicating it, though to be clear, I don't know that it's really romanticizing it either. There are attempts to kind of show like the characters in town, but in some senses, could we be looking at these more eccentric characters and kind of romanticizing them as well? Additionally, even though there are women in this book, it is very much evident that this is told through a male point of view, and I recognize that this really is kind of Bradbury looking back on his life, and in some ways maybe he is romanticizing his own boyhood, so we are seeing things through that perspective and his perspective. But in that perspective, we really are seeing women mostly as mothers or spinsters or crones in a way that at 15, 16, that surely would have felt like a trap in some ways, in terms of if this is already kind of reflecting the spirit of a small town. Sure, things have changed, but part of the perception, I think, especially in like childhood and teenage years of the place that you grow up, especially in small communities, is that they haven't changed. Now I can recognize the change, right? But part of the portrayal of women so far in this, and I'm about halfway through my reread, that I think really would have stirred some emotions up in me as a teenager that I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary to articulate, and maybe I still don't, but I at least have a slightly better one, is this quote. It says, "She sat down next to him on the swing in her nightgown, not slim the way girls get when they are not loved at 17, not fat the way women get when they are not loved at 50. And so it's just another example of how we can never win. Additionally, with the way that this may have felt frustrating to me as a teenager and ways that I'm finding myself slightly frustrated as an adult, sure, I understand that this was born somewhat of this like word association, memory recognition type of exercise. However, the prose in this, I think there is that sense of like wanting to elevate this experience, to kind of find the big and the little, to really examine these small moments. But sometimes the prose, at least to me, and I do grant that there has been quite some time since this was written, so it's reading differently to me as a modern audience than it probably read to contemporary audiences, especially because it had awards, but it reads a little flowery to me. And I don't mind flowery prose, I don't mind flowery language, but in a way that is feeling kind of disconnected in some ways, because it doesn't feel like we're really grasping on to anything stronger than just these like fleeting moments. And again, that may be the point, but that's the response. It's a listening in me nonetheless. So again, I'm only like halfway through. It's not a very long book, but I am going to finish this up and I will report back. In the meantime, it won't be long for you, but one, let me know if you have read this book or if this was ever assigned to you. Two, let me know what your least favorite ever assigned reading was, just because I'm being nosy. I will say, to give credit where credit is due, I'm currently reading a story that basically feels a little bit like the scene in State Fair about the county fair judging of the baked goods or the pickles, I can't remember which, where a town busybody is kind of like running for a position in like a women's society or a women's group, and the very specific dynamics of those kinds of groups, especially in small towns. I do kind of recognize and appreciate that reflection, despite the fact that I was never personally involved in any small town women's groups. But the kind of nuances of small town politics is interesting to me, as I've discussed before. And this is kind of like a slightly humorous twist on that. There's a little bit of satire there in that she's like accusing her competitor of being a witch because her husband, the mailman, like snooped through her mail, and the other woman is kind of like having a go at her. There is, I will grant, definite humor there. So there are bits at this that really ring true and get at something deeper. I'm not saying there aren't, but I'm also acknowledging that not all of it has aged well. And again, some of that didn't age well, I think is kind of being interrogated by the text, especially with the kind of exploration of the happiness machine that one of the men in town tries to invent earlier in the book, and his wife kind of tempers that, and it feels like at the time that she is kind of ruining this idealistic thing. However, she is running the household. She is doing all of this work. And so we're seeing this woman who is doing all the work and holding things down while her husband is kind of like off daydreaming. And so there are with things like that, especially hints of like Ray Bradbury as a science fiction author, because it never really kind of examines that machine, because it worked to some extent, but what exactly was it? And are we supposed to accept that this machine is real in this world, or is it more metaphor? And the most heartbreaking like bit of it is when his wife gets in it and she's taken to all of these beautiful places and sees all these beautiful places, and she starts sobbing, she starts crying, and this idea that she's never going to see all of that. And at this time, that is the reality. She wasn't going to get to go to Paris. She was never going to go to Rome. But even the small little things where she says, you haven't taken me dancing in years. And so we are seeing a lot of these people in these little moments. I'm not saying we aren't by any means, but I also don't think that I appreciated that when I was a teenager the same way I appreciate that now. When I was a teen, I read something like that and thought that it was a kind of losing of hope for me to have that in my own future. Again, it was this sense that if I stay in this small town that reads so true in this in so many other ways, am I losing out on all of these dreams? Even knowing based on reality that it was not the case, right? I could look around at anyone in town and know that that is not the case. But I definitely think, like I said before, I did have this sense of discomfort with some of it because of what I saw reflected and what did ring true, and then being afraid based on that other bits of the narrative could be my future, especially because so far in the book, over about halfway through, we haven't really run into little girls having adventures in the same way that we run into these two little boys. So yeah, I don't know, I'm gonna keep reading. Okay, and that is closing the book on the summer of 1928 yet again. I will say, when I went to the library to grab this copy, I saw that there is a sequel to Dandelion Wine that I did not know existed. I will not be reading that sequel. However, I do think that this resonated a lot differently with me at 32 than at 15, 16. I know, shocker. I will say part of that, as I kind of touched on earlier, I think goes back to the fact that this book is really looking backward, and at that time of my life, I was really looking forward. And I think a lot about how this was articulated by Kelly Barnhill in a discussion. And I think I've referenced this before, but I lost my notes from that talk. But she kind of articulated the differences in middle grade, young adult, and adult fiction in terms of its perspective and how the protagonist kind of interacts with the world. And I found that really interesting. And I think that this fits within that, in that even though the protagonist is like 12 years old to my math, and protagonist is a really strong word, an argument could be made that it's middle grade because it's about him finding his place in the world, and he is still really looking through a child's lens in a lot of ways, and how he kind of frames things, and the way that he discovers death even, and then the things that land as tragedies within the course of this summer. Like toward the end of the book, his brother is talking about what a bad summer he's had, and you would expect all the kind of death that has surrounded him this summer and the kind of concept of death becoming something that he is consciously aware of to be on that list. But instead it's like he dropped this statue and it broke and his sneakers went moldy and he lost a marble. I actually don't remember if the marble was part of it. But at the same time, there is this nostalgia and this sense of looking back at the summer and at this time from the narrative, and there's this bittersweet quality to it, especially when you really look at the characters in this book. We're really focused on both the very young and the very old in this, and we are really looking at the concept of death and how we lived our lives. And we've got people who have lived the entire course of their lives in this very small town, and then we've got people who've lived these rich, full lives, much of those rich, full lives outside of this town being a secret and something that lies in the history of that person in an unknown kind of way, and how this little slice of their life is but a moment in the grand scheme of things. And so that tenor and that tone really does, I think, lend itself more to the adult perspective, and just like the lethargic nature of the prose in this. And again, some of the weight that feels like it can be there in parts, some of the stuff that is slowing and bogging it down for me as a reader may just be differences in syntax now from when it was written. I absolutely acknowledge that. I will say I did get to the serial killer part, and it does wrap up in a way that I don't remember it wrapping up. I don't remember us knowing who the killer was. And I will say knowing who it was is kind of a strong statement, because the whole point is it's just this guy and the everyman of it. And I do think that that is saying something really profound in a way that I don't think I was kind of ready to understand when I was a teenager, because it is about the fact that it's just like the normal looking guy most of the time that is capable of these atrocities was going around strangling women. And the way that this was kind of like peppered in the novel, but also like not the center at all, and the lack of center again really did kind of throw me off. And I think that the structure of this, while again not being an expert on non-Aristotelian structure, was a little lopsided. Because on one hand, sure, we were looking at the kind of swath of this summer as a framing device, but part of me wonders if the framing device of like this summer, of this idea of bottling up this summer as Dandelion Wine, which I still think sounds disgusting. I've never tried Dandelion Wine. I have no plans to. But also the kind of idea of just like this common weed, this common flower, this everyday thing, and that kind of encapsulating this summer does make sense. I do like the poetry of it, but I'm not going to drink it. And I also really struggle sometimes with the layout of the book here, because again, I think like interconnected short stories may be like the closest thing to kind of grasp onto it in terms of that through line, but there is a lack of kind of forward momentum to it. And again, I struggle with forward because that implies the kind of climactic structure. So I feel like even in the ways we're talking about this, it really feels loaded, and I really have to check myself on that. And yet I kind of bounce back and forth from things feeling familiar in terms of just kind of recognizing similar human conditions, similar types of people and circumstances through time, and also being incredibly frustrated yet again by this lack of anything really happening. And yet at the same time, there is this sense that there's stuff happening here, again, with this killer on the loose, which I do think kind of upset the balance of the whole book a little bit for me, because it was something incredibly compelling, and yet it appeared so late and it's such kind of like a blip. And it was interesting to see it framed through the boys of the novel's eyes, because they were almost angry that it wasn't some like larger than life monster, and the kind of interrogation of that without actually kind of articulating the interrogation of that, I think landed really well. I really enjoyed that. However, because that is such like a happening, contrasting it with the other like little day-to-day ins and outs of these people's lives, of this town, the kind of small minutia of the summer that can become larger, it made it feel to me really imbalanced. And I wonder if it just comes from the nature of how this was formed through that kind of like association game, and then having to try and cobble it all together. However, in this instance, I don't know how I feel about that piece. As a reader, it was the most engaging piece to me, and it was definitely the piece that elicited the most emotional reaction from me. It's the piece that stayed with me the most, that and the two little old ladies like driving their like machine around, because it's not a car and it's not a golf cart. I don't have like a great visual for what that machine is. However, I just felt like that felt a little out of place amidst everything else. However, that story is also the one where we get the most insight into women in this community that aren't mothers or like very, very old, and we're seeing them through the lens of their fear over this happening and something very traumatic happening in their lives. So even outside of that, I do think that the back half of this novel had a little bit better representation and exploration of women. However, I don't think it was perfect by any means, or at least the story was still coming from a particularly male perspective. So I'm not really sure where that leaves me. I will say Dandelion Wine has always kind of stood out to me because it doesn't seem like what I would expect when being told I'm being assigned a Ray Bradbury novel, especially because we were never assigned Fahrenheit 451. We read, I think, certain short stories in like those big readers that we got every year in English class, but this is the only Bradbury novel I was assigned to read in school. And looking back, I wasn't assigned as many novels in English class as it feels like maybe I should have been. And it's always been really interesting to me that this one made the cut. I haven't gone back and read like scholarly articles about this book or like more general reception of this book in preparation for rereading this or talking about it today because I wanted it to be more of my genuine, unfiltered reaction. I really do wish I had either reading journals from the time or like even my old reading logs that exist in my old childhood bedroom, although I may not have logged this because it wasn't self-selected reading, to look at notes because somehow if those existed, my thoughts did not get imported into Goodreads when I first transferred over in 2007. I don't know if I do have notes for this anywhere, and I think I just gave my dad permission to throw away a bunch of old notebooks that had been hanging out, I think mostly from college even. And Dad, if by any chance you are watching this, do not regret that decision. I'm not regretting that decision. It's just a statement. Don't hold on to the notebooks. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly where this leaves me with this book. I think I definitely have a lot more appreciation and understanding of it from this place in my life than I did when I was a teen, but I can't say that I legitimately enjoyed it. And I'm really fighting that inner voice that's like, oh, you just didn't get it because it is a Bradbury book. But that doesn't mean that I have to respond positively to everything that Bradbury has ever written. It doesn't mean that for someone who was writing when Bradbury was writing that everything is going to land today, especially things that kind of live in the more realistic realm than a lot of his work. It is interesting too to think of this in contrast to some of his more speculative work and whether in some ways this is also speculative, and I'm not really ready to dive into that conversation or expound on that more, but I do want to just throw it out there as an idea. But if you've read this book, I would be really interested to hear what you think of it, especially in relation to one, when in your life you encountered it and how, and two, if you have read or engaged with a lot of Bradbury's other work. Because while I have read other Bradbury, I would not say I am an expert by any means. So in some ways, this book looms just as large for me for my negative reaction to it very early on as Fahrenheit 451 resonates for how large it looms both in my own reading life and in the larger cultural consciousness, and arguably for its relevancy today amidst the current kind of climate around reading and books and libraries. So I don't know that I'm really walking out of this exercise the way that I imagined. I imagined that I was going to have potentially a really strong turnaround on this book, or I would have stronger feelings one way or the other, and I think age has kind of tempered my hatred of the book, but neither would I say I particularly enjoyed it, because even amidst the kind of mosaic that we were presenting here, it didn't necessarily feel like everything really fit together in a more cohesive way. I definitely felt the kind of scattered nature of the source material, whatever that may mean. So like I said, let me know what you're thinking. Thanks for hanging out with me and going on this journey with me, though admittedly not as structured a journey as I initially planned, but let me know your thoughts. Like I said, again, let me know what your least favorite assigned reading in high school was, if nothing else, because I'm really interested in what people were assigned to read in high school and what we think of as like the commonly assigned books and whether those are accurate. But anyway, let me know what you're thinking. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. It means a whole lot. Engagement really helps, admittedly. But most importantly, read something good, and yeah, bye.